Shall we start, Chang?
Okay, Prof.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajmain. Rabbi shrahli sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma shalli ala sayyidina Muhammad. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum and a very good morning to all of you. A very special welcome to our first lecture series, which is with the topic of religion and postmodernism. And we have with us this morning a very, very distinguished scholar, a philosopher of science, Professor Muhammad Hazim Abdul Murad from the School of Languages, Civilization and Philosophy, College of Arts and Sciences, Universiti Utara Malaysia. So today, Professor Hazim will share with us a topic that is been around for almost 70 years. Possibly it is something that we are not aware of, but in reality, if we look at it closely, postmodernism is something that has been with us and that has been affecting our way of thinking in many, many areas of life. So today we often bemoan the fact that there is a desire, there is a dearth, there's a desire to look for values because there is a dearth of such values which form the basis of ethics. And as they say, despite us being technological giants today, ethics and values are very much in the process of being rediscovered through our religious and faith systems. So how indeed does postmodernism affect religions, if at all? One of the features of postmodernism, we are told, is that it denies any form of meta-narratives. And meta-narrative is another word, is a kind of description for religious systems or religious teachings. So how should we view postmodernism, and indeed, how did it start, and what can we do about it? And in the case of Malaysia, almost all of the population belong to one faith group or another. It should be interesting to learn from Professor Muhammad Hazim what has been the latest developments, and we should maybe draw lessons from what has happened elsewhere in the world. So before we actually have the pleasure of listening to Professor Muhammad Hazim, we'll just like to explain to you that first of all, we will have a very short video presentation of what our center is. We hope you will learn more about us and what we do, and that you will engage with us for topics that you may be interested in for us to have in the future in this lecture series. And then we shall start with the lecture proper. We also today take the opportunity to alert you to the fact that the Center for Civilisational Dialogue actually publishes many books, and today we have a couple that we think might be of interest to you. So do look out for the advertisements. All right, thank you so much. And now we'll have a look at our corporate video. Thank you so much.
For the first time in human history, civilizations, cultures, and groups are compelled to relate to one another on a constant and continuous basis. Yet mutual ignorance exacerbated by mutual suspicion and hostility inhibits them from establishing ties that endure and flourish. Dialogue and mutual understandings are the prerequisites for building just and equitable relations between cultures and civilizations. Dialogue of Civilization, DOC, could help strengthen relationships and improve understanding regarding the fundamental principles and practices of various communities. due to the fact that DOC was fast becoming a much-needed mechanism for discoursing issues that arise from the inevitable encounter between nations, ethnic groups, faith systems, ideologies, worldviews, and cultures. On the 13th of November 1996, the Universiti Malaya Centre for Civilisational Dialogue, UMCCD, was established.
Welcome again to our lecture series, and once again we very much like to thank Professor Muhammad Hazim Shah for being with us, for taking his time this morning to explain to us a topic that I think not many people would like to delve in, but we figure at the center it is a necessity, because if you look at the world today, everybody is talking about sustainability, everybody is talking about the SDG goals, right? The Sustainable Development Goals. And of the 17 goals, we have goal number 1, which is the elimination of poverty, zero poverty. So how can there be zero poverty when the gap between rich and poor keeps on expanding? year after year, yeah, Professor Hazim, and we figured that this might have something to do with how people perceive the systems in the world to be like. So there are good points, there are negative points, positive and negative points to postmodernism. It has its criticisms of what the world is like, especially, for example, the dysfunction, the dichotomy between the natural sciences and the human sciences, for example. So these are all issues that we should be aware of, especially those of us who are in the business of doing policies for the country and for our society. So before he begins, just like to briefly introduce Professor Muhammad Azim Shah, who holds a bachelor's degree in liberal studies in science from the University of Manchester, a master's degree in philosophy from the London School of Economics, and a PhD in the history and philosophy of science from the University of Pittsburgh, United States. He is currently serving as a professor in the School of Languages, Civilization and Philosophy, College of Arts and Sciences at the Universiti Utara Malaysia in Sintok, where he teaches philosophy courses under the Bachelor of Philosophy, Law and Business program. And prior to his retirement in 2015, he was a professor of the History and Philosophy of Science at the Department of Science and Technology Studies at the University of Malaya, where he was also the head of department from 2001 to 2007. Upon retirement, he served as a senior research fellow in the same department from May 2015 to May 2016. Prof. Hazim was also appointed as Deputy Director of International Institute of Public Policy and Management, PUMA, Universiti Malaya, from June 2013 to May 2015, and later as Research Fellow of IMPUMA from October 2017 to October 2018. Before joining the Universiti Utara Malaysia. He was the president of the Malaysian Social Science Association from 2010 to 2014. Prof. Hazim has published widely in a number of local international journals, as well as book chapters and edited books. His areas of expertise cover the history and philosophy of science, the relationship between science, religion, and culture, and comparative studies on science and philosophy in Islamic and Western civilizations. He has been appointed as a member of the Science and Islam Task Force, which was headed by the former Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. He has also spent time as a visiting research fellow at the University of Melbourne, Australia in 1993, in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, University of Cambridge in 2008. So, Prof. Hazim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Azizan, for that kind introduction. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a good morning to all participants to this webinar this morning. I am sorry there's a background noise. I'm not sure whether it enters this website, but I hope you all can hear me clearly. Boleh dengar, ya?
Yes.
Can hear. Okay, good. Okay, and I hope this event is also recorded so that those who are not able to attend this morning will have the benefit of viewing it later. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, but before that, I would like to share this slides on the screen. Is it on the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yes. Okay, so this is the topic which was given to me, religion and postmodernism, which I humbly, but perhaps foolishly accept because it's a very broad and wide topic and not easy to deal with, really. But nevertheless, it's something which has been on my mind for some time. And since I've done some reading on it, I feel quite prepared to accept the task. So the word postmodernism has been around for some time, for decades, in fact, and we all have our own understandings of the term. Yeah, and I will try to clarify what is meant by postmodernism in the slides to come. Yeah? And with regards to religion, we all know basically what religion involves. Yeah, when we think of the world's major religions like Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on, which consists of a set of beliefs, mostly based on scriptures and a belief in God, except for Buddhism perhaps, and the practices and rituals that go along with it, then we understand what we mean by religion. But today, my focus will be on one religion in particular, which is Islam, the religion which I know most about, although I might, along the way, touch on other religions as well. Let me change the slide. Okay, so although the topic is on religion and postmodernism, we cannot really understand what postmodernism is and hence its relationship with religion unless we have an understanding of what postmodernism is responding to or reacting against, which is that of modernism. So really it involves a trilogy or tripartite relationship between modernism, postmodernism, and religion. And in fact, there is a book written by the late Ernest Gellner, professor of social philosophy and sociology, initially at the London School of Economics. I attended some of his lectures, and later at the University of Cambridge. He has written a book published in 1992 called Postmodernism, Reason and Religion. If I'm not mistaken, that's the order in which it was presented. And I have written a review of that book and published in the American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences. And I will use that as a basis for the discussion today. So first thing to note is that this discussion involves three major ideologies, namely modernism, postmodernism, and religious thought. And in this case, Islam. And in fact, in the book written by Gellner, his focus was also on Islam, mainly because he was a sociology professor who teaches sociology of Islam, apart from being a professor of social philosophy. And he did his PhD research on a tribe in Morocco in North Africa. And he came up with a book called The Saints of the Atlas Mountains in North Africa. And as you know, Gellner is quite an influential thinker in the West. And although he's gone now, but his works are still referred to him. And so initially, the battle was really between modernism and postmodernism. Religion did not really enter the discourse as such in the history of Western intellectual discourse or Western intellectual thought. And Muslim scholars do intervene at certain points, either within their own cultural groups or in the mainstream of the Western academic circle, bringing forth their Islamic perspectives, namely thinkers like, for example, Said Hussein Nas and also Ziauddin Sada. In fact, Ziauddin Sada has written something on postmodernism, but I sense it's more at a more popular level, not at a deeply scholarly analysis level of scholarly analysis. And so most of the works which was written on modernism and postmodernism were written mainly by Western scholars. So what I'm going to try to do today is to present this discourse, as it appeared in Western literature on the subject, but giving my own perspective on it from an Islamic point of view. So I suppose this is where my own contribution comes in. The novelty of the discourse consists in my own projections of my own perspectives based on Islamic thought or based on Islamic thought as I see it. Some of this might have been touched on by some scholars, but some of it, I believe, have not been touched upon. Yeah? So there is an element of novelty, in fact, in today's lecture, I believe, yeah, which would make it worthwhile, I suppose, to attend to this talk. Otherwise, it would be a waste of time if I'm just repeating what others have said around the world. Yeah? And whether you think that it's a novelty and whether it's a novelty worth thinking about or perusing on, it's up to you, but I will present it nevertheless. Yeah? So if you read the literature on modernism and postmodernism, there's a, I suppose, a flood of literature. Yeah, in fact, it's impossible to cover all. In fact, I've only touched the surface, I must admit. Yeah, but I believe that I got the gist of their thoughts. Yeah, although it might appear in different forms. Yeah, the moment you try to finish one book, another book has already come up on postmodernism and so on. So it's impossible to catch up with the literature. Yeah? And modernism and postmodernism, this discourse is not limited to any one field, but cuts across several academic disciplines. Yeah? I come from a background in philosophy of science, so that's where my academic specialization is. And there is a discourse in philosophy of science involving the opposition or the contestation between a modernist perspective of science versus the postmodernist perspective of science. Yeah? But later on, I found out that this contestation is not only confined to the philosophy of science, but also in other areas, be it academic, such as the social sciences and humanities, or in broader cultural areas, like, for example, philosophy of art, conceptions of art and theater and so on, also influenced by modernism and postmodernism. Yeah? So in this day and age where you have an open sky, open space with internet and so on, it's impossible to isolate ourselves from the thinking that goes around the world today. Yeah, and so it is only appropriate that we engage in this world of ideas that is dominant in the West, since we are in no position to isolate ourselves from the influence of Western thought. Yeah? So given that kind of situation, I think it's only proper that we engage through intellectual discourse and dialogues on these topics. Yeah? And I've said the influence of postmodernism is pervasive, be it in literature, art, architecture, philosophy, social sciences, and so on. In the social sciences, how it influences social sciences is through the methodologies adopted. Yeah? For example, a more modernist approach, or an approach which is based on modernist thought, would have as its epistemological foundations a positivistic view of society and the world. Yeah, so that studies tend to be more quantitative, for example, in terms of its methodology. Whereas if you are influenced more by postmodernism, then your research methodology would most probably be qualitative rather than quantitative. So these are some of the effects that goes down in terms of practical work. Yeah. So these are not simply abstract ideas. They do infiltrate into social action and policies, which is another reason for understanding them. And my last bullet point on this slide is my own Islamic perspective on the postmodernist divide, my own take on this divide. Yeah. Okay, as I mentioned before, Gellner has written a book on postmodernism, reason, and religion. And in this book, he outlined three major positions, which is considered to be the ruling ideologies of today, namely modernism, postmodernism, and religion. And in his analysis of religion, he mentioned Islam. But then, of course, he takes Islam in not a totally positive light. For example, he mentions fundamentalism and so on, although he did mention about high and low cultures, and how Islamic high culture, which originated during the medieval period, has been revived now through the intellectualization of Islamic thought. So you can see here, when it says, religious fundamentalism is particularly strong in Muslim societies. And he finds explanation in relationship between high and low culture within Islam, where high culture, which involves, philosophical thought and so on, which was initially the preserve of the religious elites and the scholars in medieval Islamic society, and has now become pervasive culture, element of the Islamic culture, although it's still led by the intellectual elites. And as far as modernism and postmodernism is concerned, it's basically there in the West, in Western thought. And modernism, he sort of equates with what he calls here Enlightenment rationalism. And modernist thought can be traced back to the Enlightenment period of the 18th century. But before that, just as a sort of a word of caution or clarification, when you go into the literature, sometimes modernism is defined slightly differently by some authors, because they start off as a starting point, modernism in the context of art, philosophy of art. So there you have things like cubism and realism and surrealism and so on. But I'm not really concerned about modernism within the context of philosophy of art, but more within the context of philosophy as in epistemology, so that you have discussions on rationality of thought or rationality of science versus the non-rationality of science and so on. So and Gellner, I suppose, also has that in mind when he mentioned Enlightenment rationalism, not modernism in the context of philosophy of art, for those who are conversant with the literature. So, and as you know, Enlightenment thinkers, like Immanuel Kant from Germany, and Locke and Hume from Britain, they have articulated a set of ideas, philosophies, which emphasized reason, human reason, as opposed to revelation and scripture and so on, or religion. And the scientific approach in knowledge to the study of the world, both the natural world as well as the human world. And that constitutes, I suppose, the basis, the foundations of modernist thought. And in opposition to this, you have what Gellner terms as relativism, which he then equates with postmodernism to some extent. And these two are diametrically opposed, in terms of the contents of their beliefs, their ideologies, and so on. Where, for example, where in Enlightenment rationalism, you have a belief in the existence of objective truth, a unique truth of which there is a truth about the world and so on, but cannot be exclusively or definitively obtained by any society or culture. I suppose here Gellner is influenced by Karl Popper, infallibility of knowledge and so on. But nevertheless, there is that faith in the idea of objective truth and rationality. Whereas the postmodernists reject this idea of there being objective truth, rationality, and so on, and instead put forward a different set of ideas regarding knowledge and reality and so on, which is more based on secular humanist philosophies, yeah, such as the philosophies put forward by Wittgenstein and also Heidegger, Nietzsche, and so on. Yeah. So those are the three main ideologies, yeah, which are in contestation in the contemporary world, according to Gellner, and which I also, to some extent, subscribe to. Yeah? And the way I see it, yeah, in this trilogy, in this trinity, if you want to put it, the contestation between monism and postmodernism, to me, can be seen as a contestation between two secular ideologies, yeah, where you can make a demarcation between monism and postmodernism on the one hand, and religion on the other hand. Yeah, so this is my way of dividing the discourse, yeah, locating them in these two separate domains. Yeah, where to me, even though there is a clash between monism and postmodernism, but it is nevertheless a family quarrel, as I see it, yeah, which contrasts sharply with the religious tradition. Yeah. And of course, in contemporary Western thought, the religious approach to life and knowledge and so on is no longer fashionable. Yeah, unlike Eastern societies, including Malaysia, where we still hold on to tradition, religious values, and so on. In the West, religion has been identified somewhat as a form of medievalism. It's seen in the context of medieval culture, medieval thought, and no longer seriously entertained. Yeah, except as, you know, sort of in a ceremonial way. Yeah, but not seriously believed in, which is different from what we have in Eastern societies, including Malaysia. Okay, sorry. I'm just trying to see how I can because this thing is blocking my view. Okay, now. Okay. Yes, what is postmodernism? As I've said before, I'll try to give a sort of a brief definition. And although Wikipedia is not considered scholarly, but I find that the text given in Wikipedia is quite succinct and brings out the major elements of postmodernism. So I'll just read this slide, yeah, which explains in brief what postmodernism is about. Yeah. Postmodernism is an intellectual stance or mode of discourse defined by an attitude of skepticism toward what it considers as the grand narratives and ideologies of modernism, as well as opposition to epistemic certainty and the stability of meaning. Claims to objective fact are dismissed as naive realism. Postmodernism is characterized by self-referentiality, epistemological, moral relativism, pluralism, irony, irreverence, and eclecticism. It rejects the universal validity of binary oppositions like, for example, East and West, nature, the natural versus the social, and so on. Rejects the universal validity of binary oppositions, stable identity, hierarchy, and characterization. I suppose the last part refers basically to Derrida's deconstruction, where Derrida definitely opposed such binary oppositions. Now, when we talk about postmodernism, we should be aware that we are not talking about a single philosophy. Yeah. What we have is, in fact, a bunch of philosophies. Yeah. And some of these philosophies are listed here. Yeah, and some of the proponents, advocates of those philosophies are also mentioned in brackets. Yeah? For example, existentialism. And who are the proponents of existentialism? Kierkegaard, Sartre, Camus, among the leading existentialists. Yeah? And even here, I have to make a qualification, yeah, because under existentialism, there are two forms, in fact, which some people glossed over or did not really pay attention to, which is two forms. The two forms are theistic existentialism and an atheistic existentialism, meaning to say that not all existentialists are atheists. It is true that, although it's true that Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus were atheists. Yeah, in fact, that became the foundation of their existentialism. But it is not true in the case of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, yeah, who wrote books like spiritual writings and so on. And in fact, the existentialists themselves admit that Kierkegaard was the founder of modern existentialism. Yeah, and he himself was a theist, a believer in God, a devout Christian, in fact. Yeah, although not Christian in the sense of organized Christianity, in the sense of organized religion, but nevertheless someone who has a deep faith in religion, in Christianity. Although his is more personal rather than structural or organizational, the form of Christianity which he adopted. Whereas Sartre and Camus clearly declared themselves to be atheists. They did not hide that fact. So one has to be careful, when one condemns postmodernism, one condemns existentialism, for example, which postmodernism one is talking about and which existentialism one is talking about. So this word of caution is important. In case we wrongly attribute ideas which are not there to some of these groups. And then you have what is known as nihilism, or sometimes referred to also as absurdism. And the proponents are philosophers like Nietzsche, in the 19th century, a German philosopher. He was famous for his saying, God is dead. And then you have Albert Camus, famous novels like Myth of Sisyphus and so on. And then you have phenomenology as another form of postmodernism, identified with Husserl and Heidegger. And then you have deconstruction, identified with Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher. And then you have social constructivism, Foucault, Latour, and you have critical theory also listed under postmodernism, the Frankfurt School. So it is important to realize the differences within the postmodernist camp itself. Now, I realize that I'm running out of time, so I'll just hurry up. Now, although there are these different schools of thought within the same umbrella called postmodernism, there are nevertheless important similarities or shared concepts between them. And I'll just go through quickly. Number one, opposition to meta-narratives and grand theories, and instead a focus on the local and contextual. Number two, a philosophy of language that rejects fixity of meaning, that says that a particular word has particular definite particular meaning, and they reject that sort of fixed relationship between language and what that language signifies, signifier and the signified, the semiotics, and instead develops a sort of a fluid notion, a notion of a fluid relationship between language and reality, so to speak. And number three, the idea that truth and reality does not exist objectively out there to be discovered and captured and represented through knowledge. Instead, they adopted a relativistic view of knowledge and a social constructivist view of reality. So these are I consider to be the three main ideas behind postmodernism. And as I've said, postmodernism is basically a response to modernism. And 2 points which I've listed here. The rejection of logocentrism, which is found in modernism, in modernist thought, which is implied in Enlightenment. And this is found in the writings of Nietzsche and Derrida, for example. So the Aristotelian idea, of the logos as being the foundation of human existence, this is rejected by Nietzsche and Derrida and the postmodernists in general. And instead, there is a focus on the human and the social as opposed to the natural world. In the history of Western philosophy, the focus in Western philosophy has either been on the world of nature or the world of man. A focus on the world of nature has led to a scientific philosophy, which is found, for example, in logical positivism, in Hans Reichenbach. Reichenbach, I think, definitely explicitly used the term scientific philosophy, and he identified philosophy of science as a form of a scientific study rather than a humanities, something in the humanities. While a focus on man has led to a more humanistic philosophy, and postmodernism tends to lean towards the latter, which is the humanistic philosophy, of focus on man as opposed to focus on nature. Okay. What's the impact of postmodernism on religious thought? I've put down some points here. Here, the first point. As I've said before, we have to be specific as to which which school of thought under postmodernism we are referring to. If you're talking about existentialism, for example, and if you take the atheistic version, then of course, it's a rejection of the idea of the existence of God and therefore of religion itself. So if you're an existentialist like Sartre or Camus, then you cannot accept religious truth. You cannot accept religious beliefs, because there is a denial of the existence of God, and the moral values obtained through a belief in God and His messengers. But on the other hand, if you're talking about theistic existentialism, a la Kierkegaard, then there is no such rejection. Although religion then becomes something of a personal quest rather than looked at as organized religion. It is not in the social or public domain, but in the private domain. It's restricted to the private domain, which is what happened in the West. And then there is that rejection, the postmodernist rejection of the idea of absolute truth and reality, especially truth and reality that is transcendent, again, related to the divine. And this implies the rejection of God and religious truth. In fact, Sartre did explicitly say that his philosophy, i.e. existentialism, is an attempt to find out the consequences of atheism, consequences of rejecting God. How would we lead our life if we do not have a belief in God? So he carried it out to his logical conclusion. But the postmodernist critique of science, however, have endeared them to some religious thinkers and Muslim intellectuals like Ziauddin Sada, who have adopted some of their ideas in his own critique of science. Although, of course, he then put an Islamic gloss on it. But the arguments which were made by Zia, some of it were influenced by post-positivists or postmodernist thinkers like Kuhn and Feyerabend. And his criticism of objectivity and exclusive rationality of science is also influenced to some extent by the postmodernists. Although Ziauddin Sada did not adopt postmodernism totally, but he did adopt some of their criticisms of science, for example. And then there is that rejection of meta-narratives, or a belief in some grand theory, overarching theory about the world, it need not necessarily be religion only. Yeah? It could be, for example, Marxism. Marxism is also a form of grand theory, which is a meta-narrative. In fact, it forms the basis for socialist societies like Russia and China, well, before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, at least. The Marxist narrative influence views about the world, about history, about economics, and so on. So that's a grand theory, that's a meta-narrative, and it's non-religious. Yeah. But the postmodernists reject those sorts of meta-narratives, be it religious or non-religious. Yeah. In the case of religion, it would imply a rejection of any form of theocracy, which is legitimized by a religious ideology. So they would reject, for example, the form of government found in Iran, which is a form of theocracy, which is backed up by a religious ideology, which sees, the world in terms of religion or one particular religion. But this history behind the rejection of meta-narratives can be traced in the contestation between Lyotard's own philosophy, as articulated in his book, The Postmodern Condition, which is a criticism of Habermas, because he saw Habermas as trying to sort of provide a legitimation of a modern society in terms of rationality. And he saw that as dangerous to humanity, that it's sort of circumscribed the field of individual autonomy and human agency by submitting the human will under the will of the state, in a sense. And I believe that was the history behind this rejection of meta-narrative, which was then identified with postmodernism as a whole. But it began with this contestation between Lyotard and Habermas. And just a slide from a quote from Kevin Hart, who wrote the book Postmodernism, A Beginner's Guide. And here, although to some extent Hart agreed with the postmodernists insofar as the postmodernists provide a sort of a critique of modernity and modernism, and it opened the way, or it opened the door to a more enlightened view of humanity and so on. But he nevertheless ended up by rejecting postmodernism, because postmodernism rejects fixed essences, rejects the idea of universal values and meaning and so on. Yeah? So in the end, Kevin Hart concurs with the postmodernist critique of modernity, but disagrees with their rejection of values, meaning, or objective truth. So even for a Western thinker like Kevin Hart, yeah, they do not necessarily agree with modernism or postmodernism either. In fact, Kevin Hart tried to develop a sort of postmodernist theology. He was more inclined to his religious thought, but somehow wants to use postmodernism as a springboard to that religious belief or religious approach. Yeah? Now I move on to my own Islamic perspective to postmodernism. Yeah? And I titled this slide An Islamic Response to Postmodernism. Yeah? Now let's go to philosophy of language, because as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that is found in postmodernist thought is their philosophy of language, their idea of language as something which is fluid, and there being no fixity of meaning. And you can see this in the intellectual development of the philosopher Wittgenstein. Yeah? Now, which clearly to me demonstrates the opposition between two different ways of looking at language. Yeah? Now, the early Wittgenstein, who is identified with the early writing, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, thought of language as giving us a description of reality. Yeah, so it's what I would call a camera view of language. Yeah, like you have you have reality out there, you have a scenery out there, for example, and you take a camera and snap a photo of that scenery. Yeah. So the photo reflects the scenery out there. So language in the early Wittgenstein was thought to play that role or function. Yeah? That language describes the structural reality of the world. So there is a fixity of meaning. Yeah? But the later Wittgenstein, yeah, who wrote the book Philosophical Investigations, the Untersuchungen, yeah, changed his view. In fact, he sort of went 180 degrees the other way around, yeah, and said that through his notion of language games, denied the idea that language necessarily reflects a unique reality out there. So he then developed a more fluid relationship between language and reality, as it were, so that there is no fixity of meaning. Yeah. Now, what's the relevance here to my own Islamic perspective on postmodernism? Well, the way I make the connection is this. I believe that even in Islamic thought, there is a sort of philosophy of language in a sense. Yeah. And it evolves around the idea of, number one, there being two types of sentences in the Quran, namely muhakamat, which is definite and literal, and mutashabihat, which is metaphorical and allegorical. And also the idea of tafsir versus ta'wil, yeah, in the history of Islamic thought. So these are ideas which has been around amongst Muslim thinkers. This is not something which I made up, yeah, but it is there in the literature in Islamic intellectual discourse. Yeah. So my point here, yeah, is that there's already been a recognition by Muslim thinkers of the two different roles of language. One, language as informing us in a sort of direct, literal way of how the world is. Yeah. But there is also that other role and function of language, which is not that direct and literal, but which is more allegorical and metaphorical, and which is referred to in the Surah Ali Imran, verse 7, as mutashabihat. Yeah. So Islam recognizes the dual function of language. Yeah? But where else the postmodernists took this other sense of language as being fluid in its relation to reality, and therefore, in a sense, not having any definite meaning, which then borders on the idea of language as being meaningless. Islam does not equate allegorical language with meaninglessness. You see, it does not thereby denounce language as means of effective communication, even though there is an allegorical element to it. Yeah. In fact, I would argue that the postmodernists contradict themselves if they were to consistently argue that language is itself ambiguous. Yeah, it's sort of ambiguity in it. Yeah? Because if that is so, then how is it possible for them to communicate their own ideas of deconstruction, for example? Yeah. So if you were to apply deconstructionism to deconstruction philosophy, reconstructionist philosophy, then deconstructionism itself becomes meaningless, you see? Just like the critique against logical positivism, yeah? About meaninglessness. Yeah. So I think the deconstructionists contradict themselves when they say that language cannot convey any definite meaning, because then their own ideas cannot be definitively explicated. Yeah. And here I would like to suggest that the modernist postmodernist contestation or conflict was brought about mainly by the distinction between the natural and the human or the social, where the postmodernists privilege the former, namely the natural world, whilst the postmodernist, the latter, which is the human and the social world. Now, the Islamic perspective, I believe, in contrast to Western thought, privileges neither the natural nor the social or the human, but considers both as having issued from the same source or center, namely God or the divine as the source of all being. Yeah. So if you think of a sort of a tripartite relationship or trinity between God, man, and nature, then the world of man and the world of nature are both subservient to the transcendent. Yeah. And neither the natural world or the human world is privileged in terms of epistemology or even metaphysics. Yeah. Now, the Quran refers to both the world of nature and the world of man, but with Allah as the creator and Lord of all the world, so Rabbul Alameen. Yeah? Hence, neither the world of nature nor the world of man determine standards of truth and reality, which is what is found in the contestation between modernist and postmodernist philosophies. Yeah? The modernists privilege the world of nature as setting the standards for objective truth and reality and so on, whereas the postmodernists accept the idea as found in Protagoras, for instance, where he says that man is the measure of all things. So standards of truth and so on is man-made. So that's the other extreme. But Islam does not privilege either the natural nor the social world. Yeah. So rather than setting the world of nature and the world of man as standing in opposition or with one above the other, in Islam there is a triadic relationship between God, man, and nature, where man and nature stands in subservience to God. Yeah. So that's where I believe Islam differs from either postmodernism or modernism. Yeah. And here I would like to further support my argument by quoting lessons from the Surah Ar-Rahman. Yeah. I believe some of you are familiar with the Surah, yeah, which repeatedly asks you, which of the favors of God do you deny? Yeah? Now, in the Surah Ar-Rahman, yeah, I'd like to quote here, especially verses 4 to 8. Yeah? Verse 4, yeah, which reads, yeah, this is a translation, of course, English translation. The sun and the moon follow courses exactly completed, and the stars and the trees both alike bow down in adoration, prostration, yeah? Sujud. Yeah? And the firmament, the skies, has he raised high, and he has set up the balance of justice in order that you may not transgress due balance. So establish weight with justice and fall not short in the balance. Now here, if you look carefully, you will find that verse 4 refers to a natural process and the law which binds its behavior, the astronomical laws. Yeah, we are familiar with Kepler's laws and Newton's laws and so on, which relates to the regularity found in the natural world, yeah, the cosmos and so on. And then verse 5 says, the stars and the trees both bow down in adoration, prostration. Now, verse 4 can be literally understood, but not verse 5. Yeah. How can the stars and the trees bow down, literally speaking? Yeah, you can only understand this in a metaphorical way. And here the philosopher Al-Kindi mentioned this as, in fact, the rationale for philosophical interpretation of some of the verses. He considers this as mutashabihat, verse 5, but not verse 4. You see? And then verse 6 says, the firmament has he raised high, and he has set up the balance. So there's a balance between a postmodernist view of the world and a modernist view of the world, so to speak. Well, using the language that is around now. Yeah? But the idea is basically related or has some similarity to it. Yeah? So in other words, all these ideas can be included under a vast umbrella, the firmament which has he raised high, and that he has set up a balance between them. In other words, neither is privileged, but that both has its due, has its due authority in a sense. Yeah. So he has set up a balance between the natural and the non-natural, and both are legitimate in a sense, and that you should not transgress that balance or fall short in the balance. Treat it with justice. So that's the way I read it, which says that it's neither a privileging of the natural world nor the social or human world, but that you should set a balance between the two, and this balance is under that firmament, the high firmament of which at the top is the divine himself. Yeah. So that's my reading of Surah Ar-Rahman in support of my earlier claims about how the Islamic perspective does not privilege either the natural or the social or the human. Yeah? Now, here, there's an interesting reflection in my mind on the relationship between postmodernism and the Shahada. Yeah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah. Now, the first part involves denial, while the second half involves affirmation. Yeah? What the Sufis call nafi and isbat. Nafi is the denial part, isbat is affirmation. Yeah? Now, at best, the postmodernist is involved only in the first part, but falls short of the second. Yeah, the postmodernist can only affirm the first part of the Shahada. There is no God. That means there is nothing worth submitting to. Yeah. So for the nihilist, for example, it would be in perfect conformity with this idea, because the nihilist denies any commitment to any value. Yeah. I.e., there is nothing worth worshipping. Yeah? But for the Muslim, he does not end there. Yeah? He then makes the further statement, except Allah. There is no God but or except Allah. Yeah. And that second part, yeah, is something which is not found in the postmodernists. Yeah. But then for some postmodernists, the second part cannot be articulated conceptually. So if they belong to that group, then they still have the possibility of aligning themselves with religious thinkers. Yeah. Some religious postmodernists, as I put here, sees the possibility of salvaging both postmodernism and religion by treating postmodernist critique of the Logos as a means at the door of subjective truth. Because, as you know, for example, with the Sufis, they see reason as a wonderful instrument that has to be finally discarded when you're about to enter into this different realm of the divine, the door of subjective truth, as I put it. So, postmodernism, I suppose, yeah, can play that role of helping us to abandon reason, but not as an end in itself. Yeah. Now, here I have quoted Wittgenstein, yeah, who said in his later works, that of which one cannot speak, thereof one should be silent. Yeah? Which is quite consistent with the view expressed in the Tao Te Ching, that the Tao that can be spoken of is not the real Tao. And in the Tao Te Ching, there are various references to the idea of the Tao. Yeah? But then the Tao cannot be fully articulated. It is something ineffable. Yeah. So that proclamation of the existence of God, La ilaha illallah, the second part is perhaps something which is beyond reason. It is a leap of faith. Yeah, it is achieved through subjective truth, and that is more experiential, perhaps. Yeah? That is something which the postmodernists reject, because for them there is no door to the transcendent. There is only this world. Yeah? But for the Muslim, there is a door to the transcendent. Yeah? Whatever that might be. Yeah? Okay, I would like to skip this because it might be blasphemous. Now, my last point, yeah, having explained the philosophy behind it, now I would like to relate it to the social context, because I believe that philosophical ideas, yeah, cannot be looked at as something which occurs in a vacuum and devoid of any social implications. Yeah. Now, here I refer to the framework provided by Daniel Bell, who probably got it from the sociologist Max Weber. Yeah? His idea that there are domains in Western society, especially liberal democratic societies, which entail some sort of contradiction. Yeah. And the contradictions existed because of the differences in these three domains and their focus and content. Yeah? So the first is the political administrative domain, the second, the economic technological domain, and third, the cultural artistic domain. Now, in Western societies, postmodernism, from my point of view, at best occurs in the third domain, but not in 1 and 2. In 1 and 2, we find that it is still largely dominated by modernist thought, with its emphasis on order, objectivity, rationality, and truth. Yeah. So, for example, science and technology is something which is emphasized by Western countries, especially advanced countries like America, Germany, France, Britain, and so on. And this occurs in the first and second domains. Yeah. So that the science policies, for example, is based on the idea of the objectivity of science and rationality of science and so on. They do not abandon that belief. Yeah. The ruling class adopts this sort of ideology. Yeah? And Western societies thereby remain strong and powerful in spite of postmodernism, as long as postmodernist thought remain within the cultural sphere. Number 3, Western powers are unlikely to change their domestic and foreign policies, which are dictated largely by national interests, because it is the modernist ideology that sustains functionally the scientific industrial complex, yeah, of modern Western societies. And you find this sort of contradictions and inconsistencies in Western societies. For example, even when you look at the case of France, perhaps here it's probably a sort of different sort of contradiction, but nevertheless it's sort of inconsistency also. Now, take the case of France, for instance. Despite the presence of thinkers such as Sartre, Camus, Foucault, and Derrida, yet Islamophobia exists in France, and there is a lack of tolerance of the other and their beliefs. If you read the works of Sartre, Camus, and Foucault, and Derrida, you would think that, you know, there's a sort of a tolerance of the other. Yeah, there is that rejection of hierarchy, rejection of dominance of one by the other, and yet you find that in France there is a lack of tolerance of the other, especially the Muslims. Yeah, for example, the ruling against the wearing of hijab and so on. Yeah, which contrasts with the ideas of these thinkers about liberalism and so on. So there is that hypocrisy in Western society as well. Yeah? So, okay, let's move on to the last slide. And here, I believe that discourse on modernism and postmodernism is a legacy of the Western intellectual tradition, which persists till today. Now, despite the hype and the perception of religious thought as being somewhat archaic and medievalist, I think it is still possible for religious thought to reclaim the epistemological space hijacked by both modernist and postmodernist thought. Western society and culture is basically modernist in the realms of politics, administration, economic, and technology, but increasingly postmodernist in the cultural sphere. This cultural containment of postmodernism, and that means it doesn't allow it to spill over into the political, administrative, and the economic, technological. So this cultural containment of postmodernism enables Western societies to remain functionally strong. And in fact, Daniel Bell referred to this as cultural contradictions of capitalism. Now, my view on this is that Islamic societies must not mimic the Western model and system of thought, but must articulate its own intellectual and cultural position in accordance with its own religious tradition and value system. So with that, I end my talk today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Prof. Hazim. That was seriously, for most of us, an exquisite presentation of what postmodernism is currently, you know. I think you've assisted us a lot tremendously by doing your study on the topic. I think it's beyond most of us to read all those philosophers, if I may say so. But you explicated the main points of their thinking vis-a-vis postmodernism, and before that, modernism itself. And it's interesting that you said that both these systems are actually systems of thinking in the secular mode, which is a very interesting thing in itself, because like you said, we have to treat very carefully. And the fact that you did not share with us your third last slide, I sort of understand why, you know, because when we do critical thinking, we sometimes come out with new ways of looking at things, new ways of understanding. But perhaps our culture is not very forgiving in terms of us sharing too openly. But in any case, I think what was being shared is absolutely very, very important, because, as you said, it is already, postmodernism is already in the culture of peoples of the world, whether or not they claim to have their belief system strong in their lives. Yeah. So may I start with some questions, with a couple of questions to your good self to respond to vis-a-vis your lecture now. Is that okay?
Yeah. I can take questions, no problem.
Okay. Question number one from our audience. How do advocates of postmodernism then neglect the objectivity in things like mathematics? For example, for every sane person, 1 + 1 is always 2. So please respond to our colleague here.
Yes, okay, I'll take the question one by one. Now, I did listen personally to a lecture by a philosopher and sociologist by the name of David Bloor, who considers himself a social constructivist, influenced by sociology of knowledge, Mannheimian sociology of knowledge, Edinburgh School. And in the Edinburgh School and the social constructivists in general have an explanation about how mathematics can be looked at as being a social construction. For example, the idea of negative number and -1, -2, that can be interpreted when you look at some social practices, like, for example, debts, when you owe someone money and so on. And before the social constructivists, the empiricists also had an empiricist construal of mathematical knowledge. Like, for example, they say that, how do we get the concept of numbers? It's basically by counting. And counting is something which we do as a matter of experience. When we experience the physical world, we look at it in terms of numbers. We have 1 stick, 2 sticks, 3 sticks, and so on. That's how we learn numbers in school. So it's something which can be explained in empirical and social terms. But then I have my own doubts also, and I did question David Bloor on this. I said, how do you explain the concept of a number like, for example, square root -1? square root minus 1. It's cannot, to me, it cannot be explained in terms of, human depth or something. And the conjugate numbers and so on, some abstract numbers. And I don't think the social constructivists have a satisfactory explanation to it. Yeah? So yeah, so I disagree with the social constructivists on the philosophy of mathematics. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. And there's another question here. Good morning, Prof. It says, I refer, our colleague here refers to religion in general. And he or she talks about there being many types of sects and interpretation in the religions of the world. Has this happened because of the different social contexts that you mentioned in your lecture? Is this because of the fact that from this situation, can we conclude that it is postmodernism that has sort of led to to people loosely interpreting religion on their own and not depending on real prophets, so to speak, something like that? Yeah. So I'm sorry to our good friend who asked this question. I think that is the gist of your question, right? Thank you, Prof.
Okay. Now the bifurcation which occurs in religious groups, yeah, and how that could be an occasion for someone to adopt a sort of a postmodernist view of religion, maybe out of disillusionment, perhaps, yeah, with what's going on out there in society. But back to the notion of this bifurcation which occurs in religious groups, I can think of two cases, namely the split in Christianity between the Protestants and the Catholics, yeah, initially triggered by Martin Luther in Germany in the 16th century, I believe. And the second is in the Muslim world, the split between the Sunnis and the Shia, yeah, which occurred as a result of this exclusive or perhaps misguided devotion to the family of the Prophet, yeah, which led to the Shia movement. Yeah. And so there were reasons, yeah, for the split, yeah, and how it continued and became sustained later on. Yeah? So, for example, in the case of Protestantism, Martin Luther rejected the authority of the church and the Pope because he said that there is no mediation in religion. You don't need the Pope to mediate between you and God. You can relate directly to God. Yeah. So this is more personal and more direct and perhaps more authentic. The idea of authenticity is very much part of postmodernist thought. Yeah. So in a way, it's sort of legitimizing postmodernist approach to religion. I suppose some religious postmodernists do adopt that approach. Yeah. And perhaps they find some sort of consolation in that. Yeah. So I'm not totally against the idea of taking up that approach. Yeah. Okay.
Right. I have one question for your attention. Can we say, without being apologetic, is there merit for, in the case of Islamic, in the case of Islamic world, is there merit for Muslim writers or thinkers to engage the secular philosopher, especially those who are critical of postmodernism? And I read somewhere that they call themselves the meta-modernists, or that they are now entering a phase called meta-modernism, wherein they speak about the weaknesses of postmodernist thinking itself. So do you think there's merit for Muslim thinkers, philosophers like yourself, and you did share some points just now, yeah? In this context, is there merit for us to engage the so-called secular philosophers? Not for us to label ourselves as meta-modernists or as postmodernists, but to actually give support to some of the what may be seen to be good criticism of postmodernism, which is one of the characteristics of postmodernism or meta-modernism is that they want to emphasize again the integration of science and religion, for example, or you want to see how social sciences and natural sciences might be integrated once more, instead of being dichotomized or separated one from the other. Thanks, Prof.
Yes, yes, I would give my blessings to that sort of effort and enterprise. I think it is a much needed effort. And of course, if you look at it even from a Western point of view, this is a free world, you see. You're free to criticize any philosophies or any ideas. So it's not so much the label that's important, whether it's meta-narrative or meta-modernism or whatever, meta-postmodernism or whatever. What is important is the substance of your criticism. Yeah, how convincing, rationally, logically is your criticism. To me, that's the yardstick. Yeah, if you're able to do it, then go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any more questions from the floor? Prof? Yes, go ahead. Dr. Maisara, go ahead. Yeah.
For Azizan, this is Dr. Zida.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Hazim, thank you so much. It's so great to see you.
Why don't you turn on your camera, Zida? I haven't seen you for so long.
Tak apalah.
Is this a postmodernist approach or what? Not showing your face?
Okay.
Good.
There I am. Prof, thank you so much for that intellectual review. I think you are one of those rare, scholars in Malaysia who could do, a review of philosophical thoughts, in trying to, trying to find the balance between Western thinking and, the way that, more on the Eastern way of thinking. I just want to have I just have a question, Prof. I mean, I don't know whether I can articulate it well because I'm not so good in philosophy, but when you were talking about this theistic existentialism, you were talking about this Kierkegaard, idea, and then you also talking about how Gellner was talking about Enlightenment rationalism. I find it very interesting in the sense of, how I don't know, I find some connection to the way, I don't know, my understanding of much more of the sophistic sort of way of thinking in looking at, you have a personal quest in finding the truth, but within this idea that there is the truth out there, right? And I just want to have your opinion whether you see some similarity with, the sophistic perspective, like, for example, Rumi talking about mystery, longing, it's always a process of finding truth. And also this, I think a more recent, I mean, lately when we talk more practically, where methodology in science as well has, going towards more of this idea of praxis, like, you and also interdisciplinary approach, trying to combine scientific knowledge with local knowledge, and trying to find the balance between, knowledge that is, very systematic and knowledge that is a bit more ambiguous. So I just want you to have your perspective on that, whether there's a, relationship between those perspectives. Yeah. I don't know whether I make it clear.
Yes, you made it absolutely clear. My problem is whether I can give a good answer to that. Now, yes, this thing about Sufism and its relationship to postmodernism. Yeah? Now, I think someone like Said Hussein Nas would deny any sort of explicit connection between them, but or maybe he has a different idea. I'm not sure, but I can understand that the postmodernist approach, to some extent, can be seen to be compatible with Sufism, especially if you look at phenomenology. In fact, the French writer who I think adopted Shiism, Muslim Shia version of Sufism, Henry Corbin, the famous Henry Corbin, who is also a phenomenologist, wrote something on Ibn Arabi, on Ibn Arabi's what you call concept of the imaginal world. which is highly subjective. Yeah, but then the Sufis believe that truth will not necessarily be objective. It's personal. Yeah? So this quest for subjective truth, yeah, that there is a reality out there which is transcendent in a sense, which is not confined to the empirical and the rational, which is the confines of the positivists. Yeah? So that aspect of it, I think, can be adopted somewhat. Yeah, even if you are Muslim. Yeah, this idea in a phenomenological experiential reality. Yeah. But the problem is, how do you turn that into something which is beyond the individual autonomy, which is somehow socialized? Yeah, because you must remember that in Islam, religion is not something purely individual or autonomous. Yeah, there is a social element to it. Yeah, for example, prayers. You have congregational prayers. That's sembahyang Jum'ah, yeah, Jum'ah, and it's considered to have higher merits and so on. So, despite that individual subjectivity, there must be a social element to it. Yeah, for example, the Sufis, they have their own zawiyah, they have their own communes, a community, where individual Sufis, practicing Sufis, form their own communities. Yeah, so I think one should not be left solely within one's individual self. Otherwise, one gets into solipsism, yeah, kind of solipsism. One has to engage with others of similar interests and similar ways of thinking, and form one's own community, in fact, so that one is not lost within oneself. Yeah. So that's my advice. If you want to take this approach, yeah, you must not get lost within your own self and become a solipsist. Yeah. You have to engage with some others who have similar ways of looking at the world. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Prof.
Okay.
Prof, mute, Prof.
Oh, mute. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zida. I think we share the thinking behind that important question to Prof. Hazim. Thank you, Prof. Hazim, for the answer. One more question from Associate Professor Dr. Vishalachi, Director of Center of International and Comparative Education, Universiti Malaya. He asks, what is your opinion on authentic dialogue for intersections with culture and religion to enhance teaching and learning in schools and universities?
Oh, yes, I agree with such dialogues, but they have to be scholarly based. It's not influenced by emotions or prejudice and so on. And perhaps to start off with, you have to make it closed door, because the public out there might not be able to accept some of these ideas. Yeah. So if you're really sincere about it, then such efforts, I think, should be encouraged. Yeah? But it has to be scholarly based. In other words, it's not something which is off the top of your mind or influenced unduly by prejudices or emotions. Yeah? And I believe that both parties can benefit, or the multi-parties can benefit from such dialogues. In fact, I learn a lot by talking to others who do not share my views. Yeah? Okay.
Yep. Thank you so much for lending your support to the importance of dialogue, because dialogue is like trying to understand where the other is coming from. Yeah. This is the important message of dialogue. And yes, you have said something very important there. Things have to be based on knowledge and good scholarship. And I think sometimes when people talk about religious values or religious beliefs, they assume that the other has the same level of understanding and level of knowledge. Yeah? So these are some of the adab of dialogue. So thank you so much to Associate Professor Dr. Vishalachi. We hope that you will join us for more of our programs. Any more points to consider, together with Prof. Hazim. We are also sharing with you on the screen a couple of books that we have at the center. It is not related to postmodernism per se, but it is looking at you know, the two worlds. If you look at the book Occidentalism and Orientalism, I think for a very, very long time, the Western world and the so-called Eastern world, you know, distinguishes the fact that the West will always be the West and the East will always be the East. And one of the ramifications of that latter statement is that the Easterners are much more steeped in their religious values, in their faith beliefs, whereas the West is not. The West is secular. But I think today the borders have blurred, and that I think the bridges of understanding has to be quickly built, because again, we refer to the global mandate that all of us are supposed to support, which is Sustainable Development Goals. So without creating a mantra out of that, because I know in some quarters, there's also criticism as to so-called religious people supporting those values of the SDGs. So I hope, like Prof. Hazim says, we will base our criticisms and opinions on solid foundations of knowledge and research, so that we will not have something else to think about in terms of our differences. So from Fong Kai Kwan to everyone, there's another question just now. What was the question, Chang?
Prof, do you think secularism is good in country administration, or need to be comprises religions?
Okay. Should the administration of a country avoid secularism and take out values from the religious dimension, for example? Is that what you mean? Something like that, yeah? So we'll get Prof. Hazim to respond. Prof? You're not too tired yet, please.
Yeah, okay. Quite a difficult question, actually. Now, secularism, yeah. How do you understand the term secularism is one thing. If you mean by it separation of religion from public life, such as in administration, in politics, and so on, whether you mean it in that sense or whether you mean it in the sense of belief only, like the idea that you know, we shouldn't let religion influence our pursuit of science or knowledge in other fields and so on. But I take it that you're asking me in the first sense, yeah? That it's to do with social practice in terms of politics and government and administration and so on. Yeah. Yes. Now, I'm in two minds about this, actually. Yeah. On the one hand, I believe that there should be that one should take into account the history of the country. Yeah. In fact, in social reality, that's what happens. Yeah? Even though the French or the English might claim themselves to be liberal Democrats and so on, but in the end, there is a sort of a primacy of French culture or English culture within their societies. Yeah. So there is no denying that fact of the entrenchment of historical cultural traditions. Yeah? So in that sense, you cannot really divorce religion from social life. Yeah. But having said that, I also acknowledge that if you talk about Malaysian society, for example, now Malaysia is a post-colonial society which has inherited some of the features of the colonial government. Yeah. So in a sense, we are already secular. Yeah. Because why? Because there is this division, separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judiciary. Yeah. So that also has already made it secular in a sense, because religion is not the overarching, or religious authority is not the overarching authority. If you look at our laws, for example, the legal system also we have adopted from the British. Yeah. So whatever we might think is the ideal, the reality is we are in Malaysia, we are not a non-secular society. We are a secular society in some ways. But this does not preclude the freedom to practice religion. Yeah, especially Islam, which forms the religion of the majority. So in social reality and for the sake of national stability, political and social stability, giving free rein to Islamic practice and so on is something, in fact, which helps to maintain that social stability. Yeah, but there are other cases where a restriction on secularism could, or allowing religion to predominate, can have negative consequences. For example, in the case of India, yeah, previously it was the Congress party which was in power, and then the BJP took over. Yeah, now when the BJP took over, secularism tends to have a lesser influence. Yeah, because you have influence of religion. Yeah, and there it tends to create friction when you let secularism down. Yeah, so it depends on the circumstances. Yeah, okay, that's all.
Okay, one more question from Dr. Maisara from the Department of Science and Technology Studies. Salam Prof, can I know your view about the Islamic response with regards to technology and culture? For example, we may refer to the current issues that we are facing vis-a-vis artificial intelligence and robotics. But how would Islam respond, to developments that technology in terms of AI overcoming the culture? You know what I mean? AI is being enculturated, but not without its own impacts vis-a-vis in the sense of us being religious or otherwise.
Yeah. Good question. And Maisara, can you turn on your camera before I answer the question? Otherwise, I won't answer the question. Maisara, are you there? Okay. That's a prize for answering the question. You have to turn on your camera, but not off it so soon. Why did you put it off so soon? Okay. So that I can give a better answer. Okay, now that's not an easy question either to answer, yeah? Because AI has become very prominent now, and now that you have this movement towards adopting IR 4.0, yeah? Carl Schwab came out with this term, yeah? Industrial Revolution 4.0. And the next stage in our technological economic development would be towards that end, towards the pursuit of IR 4.0, which involves artificial intelligence, adoption of artificial intelligence in human technologies to a large extent. Yeah, and to me, it could go either way. Yeah, it could go either way. It has serious implications for humanity. Yeah. Because the simulation and the mimicking of a human being, yeah, through robotics, through artificial intelligence, raise serious problems about the nature of the human self also. Yeah, and I'm a bit worried, frankly speaking, when Saudi Arabia grants citizenship to the robot Sophia. Yeah, a very paradoxical society. Yeah, on the one hand, it's Wahhabi based, very conservative. On the other hand, it seeks to adopt the latest in Western technology without a proper understanding of how this fits in with the overall cultural and religious makeup of that society. Yeah. So one has to be careful, yeah, as to what it means for humanity. because eventually it will go down to real social practices, like, for example, decision-making at various levels. Yeah? For example, the legal system could adopt artificial intelligence for cases which it thinks can be resolved through artificial intelligence systems. Yeah, and I think there are some societies that have already adopted this, yeah, where the legal system, instead of appointing a judge, uses artificial intelligence, or a judge at least merely endorses the decision made by the artificial intelligence machine. Yeah, and what more with artificial intelligence machines like Deep Blue, the supercomputer Deep Blue, being able to defeat a chess champion, grandmaster like Garry Kasparov, yeah, 1990s. Yeah? So there is that question of what it means to be a human being. Yeah, is humanity simply a matter of transposition of logos on to some physical material, or is there a spiritual element? And if so, how can it be articulated? So there is that worry that eventually the reality of the spiritual might be dismissed because it cannot be manifested in the way which can be reproduced through artificial intelligence machines. Yeah? So one has to think seriously about this. And here, I'd like to relate this to what the Prophet himself has said about the Dajjal, the coming of the Dajjal. Yeah? Because he said that the Dajjal is one-eyed. Yeah? And I don't think it's a case of physical eye. Yeah? Because human beings, yeah, if you look at the human brain, they're divided into the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is more to do with the logical and the mathematical and the analytic. The right to do with the emotions and so on. So artificial intelligence is more to do with the left, but it tries to somehow copy the right, yeah, but not in a realistic way, because it can't. Because the right involves spiritual, emotions, and so on. So there is that worry that this one-sided approach to reality, by emphasizing on one eye alone, could lead to some sort of a Dajjal culture in future. So one has, to me, I think one has to reflect on that. Okay.
Thank you, Prof. Hazim. I think the statement that we need to understand what it means to be human. Yeah? We need to truly understand. And I think this is where religion comes into the picture. And I think there's a lot of work to be done by so-called religious people in terms of bringing out, of fleshing out the religious knowledge that can inform narratives vis-a-vis what is a human being, especially at this moment in our history, humankind's history. And I think the word civilization itself is rooted in, a lot of it is rooted in religion itself, right? Adab, it comes from the word adab in Arabic, which is related to peradaban, right? So if you lose the religious narrative, one very important form of meta-narrative, then what would our discussions be like in the future? So I think there's a lot of concepts to be unpacked still, to use Dr. Zida's term in one of our discussions. And I think we need to follow through some of the ideas that you've introduced to us this morning, shared with us this morning. And those of us who are in religious traditions, we'd like to invite you to share some of your ideas and suggestions for the future of our dialogues. Because at the center, we look at the center as dialoguing in two modes. Yeah? One, we dialogue what is civilization. So another, we actually unpack the word civilization itself. What does it mean to be civilized? And what is civilization in the future? So inshallah, that's coming for all of us in the future. Thank you once again, Prof. Hazim. I think there are many more questions as a result of the questions being asked, but I think the people are holding it back first. So thank you so much, Prof. Terima kasih banyak-banyak. Terima kasih Dang Peladi, and to all of our colleagues who have been so kindly taking their time to join us this morning. We really appreciate your time. This is not an easy topic, yeah. But I think each one of us have some take-home points ponder and to consider. Inshallah, it will have an impact on our future thinking and our future actions. With that, I end with the phrase Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And I hand you back to Mr. Charlie Wei and also Mr. Ahmad Muhammad at our center. So what do you want us to do now?
Hi, can everyone turn on the camera so that we can have a group photo?
Okay. We done? Yeah.
Hold on, Prof.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Prof. Hazim. Thank you, Zid. Thank you, Masara. And the other colleagues.
Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, thank you. See you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Hazim.
Thank you.
Azim.
You can come and visit us one day.
Maaf lewat masuk. Tadi ada town hall. Masuk Azizan.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Kita jumpa peluk-peluk.
Alright.
Assalamualaikum.
Salam. Bye.